Schleper. I'm president of Shakopee Heritage Society, and we do lots of presentations and tombstone cleaning and tombstone tours. We do a little bit of everything. Okay, but as we start, I want to let people know that the Shakopee Heritage Society wants to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Dakota. So we have to honor with gratitude the land itself, the people who have stewarded it through the ages, including the Ojibwa and other indigenous nations. Now, high over the hill of Canterbury Down, which is over there, now it's way back over there, okay, on what was Eagle Creek Boulevard, or County Road 16, is the Calvary Cemetery. It is privately owned. It was established in 1856, and then it was deeded to St. Mark's in 1859. The land was owned by the Reis family, and Valentine Reis, either one or two, deeded it to St. Mark's in 1859. So the Reis are right over here, and we'll get over to them a little bit more, but this is a picture of the old and the younger, but so I could figure out which one is the one who deeded it to him, but I'm thinking it's probably the oldest one. But it's interesting because once it was going on, I know that David Lennox Howe, who was an entrepreneur, but he also was a pharmacist downtown Shakopee, and in January of 1877, there was an old settlers association meeting, and he was there, and he said about the Calvary Cemetery, "I wish I could say that equal interest has been taken by the Roman Catholics of our city in providing us beautiful grounds. Their grounds are situated about 12 miles below our city," so that's Shakopee, right? So 2 miles away, in a desolate, barren, and forlorn bluff. It's dangerous to ascend. I hope the effort will happen now by Reverend Plutz and other people of the church to locate a bigger one. Okay. And of course they did the one on 10th Avenue, right? The 10th Avenue Catholic Cemetery. It's often just, that was St. Mark's, right? But when the Church of the Immaculate Conception, which was the Irish church in Shakopee, was organized in 1864, they also buried their dead here at Calvary Cemetery. Okay. The Church of the Immaculate Conception changed its name to St. Mary's Church in 1877. So when St. Mark's Cemetery and St. Mary's Cemetery was opened in March of 1877, are you finding the stupid thing? Good job. Okay, so the one on 10th Avenue, that was in 1877 that they did. But still people continued to use this place until about 1925, okay? They ended up adding a fence and the gates. That was in 1929. And then the Calvary Cemetery itself was heavily vandalized in the 1940s. The VFW Post 4056 and other places restored the cemetery in 1972. That became a community service project. And in 1972, in the newspaper this article about when they redid this thing, and they said, we found many broken stone in a pile in the middle of the cemetery. So we played them in rows, trying to match their stones together if we could find whatever possible. In other words, we're not, what this looks like probably was not the same as it was way back then. Also, another problem about this place is Scott County itself did not have a civil records until 1871. So that like 20 years later, right? So there are church records from St. Mark's from 1856 and the Church of the Immaculate Conception, which became St. Mary's Church in 1864. They do have birth, marriage, and burial records. But it's weird, like for one of the first record burials that they have, said it was in St. Miriam Church in Shakopee, which is not, that was probably this, they just probably didn't know and just wrote it. They think that it was probably from a traveling priest. At that time they were moving around all the time. So he served 5 different parishes, so he probably just made it what those Catholic priests do sometimes. All right. We also know that the Calvary Cemetery Restoration Committee in 2017 added the monument, which is right here. And on this side and the other side are all the names of all the people who were buried here that they know of. Okay? Most of them are not ones that are on here. Those are there too, but there are other ones too, because we don't know where they are. There's no anything about them. There are no tombstones for them. So again, these things are the way that we can know who was here. And it is kind of interesting to go through this list of the names. You're like, oh, I didn't know those people were buried here. But that's basically what it was. So that's the history of Shakopee Cemetery. But I'm going to start with one that's on this list, but it's not on here. Okay? And that's Priscilla Jane St. Adelaide Elder. She was born in 1840 and died in 1862 here in Shakopee. They say, when I first was reading it, said St. Adelaide Elder coughed. Crimson droplets appear on her lips, the first sign of tuberculosis, or consumption, as it was called. Tuberculosis is something that people don't often think about it anymore. But in the 19th century, people in Minnesota were really worried about it a lot, because people would suddenly have flushed cheeks, bright eyes, fever, loss of appetite, and most of all, the cough that kept going on, coughing. At that point, they said it was really something that people were afraid of, but they realized it wasn't they can do because it's something that's happening. It was dreaded, but it was also romanticized. The victim slowly, graciously faded away, transcending their corporate bodies, the immortal souls shining through. So the newspaper articles sounded like it's like a great old thing, but it wasn't so much. But actually, it affected the poor more than the wealthy did. It was more for females than men, okay? And it could be people of any ages. It was especially prevalent among young adults. So people said it really, like they basically cruelly strike down those in the prime of their lives. So we have Priscilla Jane Elder, born in 1840 in Pennsylvania. Her parents were Jane Elder and Anne O'Connor Elder. By 1850, John O'Connor Elder died, and Jane and her siblings were living with various families in the area, which is very common. There was often where, the family, someone, like the mother died, but the mother's basically the one who's taking care of it because the father's doing something else. So suddenly they have different family members take over with that. So James' brother, William James, moved to Hastings, Minnesota with her uncle in 1867. Her brother Peter was a banker in Philadelphia. Thomas died in the Civil War, and Jane's sister, Mary Ann, went and became a nun, St. Mary Leonard. Okay? So as for Jane, she went to the convent of the St. Benedict Convent in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania, and became a nun. Okay. Now, so that's in Pennsylvania at this time, right? So the Reverend Wimmer, I should say, said he believed that they should get people going to the west of the United States. And so on October 9th, 1862, he, along with Sister Clara Vogel, which is a lay sister, Sister Mechtil Richter, and Saint Adelaide Elder, which was Priscilla Jane Elder, arrived to Shakopee and founded St. Gertrude's Abbey, convent, I should say. She was 21 years old at that time. Okay. Now, why is that part? They started the convent and the Academy of the Sister of St. Benedict's. Started in 1866. You know where that was located? You know where St. Mark's Church is? Heading south. Now it's a parking lot. But that actually was where the convent and academy was. And what was so interesting was they built a large 2.5-story limestone building at the corner of 4th and Atwood Street. The convent and academy opened from 1862 to 1880. Women only were there to go to school. You know that it's not there mostly because the priest in St. Mark's didn't want them there. He felt they weren't German enough, even though they are German names, but it's probably not High German. He probably liked High German versus Low German or whatever. Okay. So eventually that place became the Scott County Poorhouse, and then it became the second hospital in Shakopee. It is not a parking lot. So just in terms of what it looked like there, just so you know, I mean, this big old building. I remember this. I remember when it was torn down in the 60s or 70s. I have to look and find out exactly. Do you know when it was?
My grandma was at nursing home in the area.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, so that makes sense to do that too. You were born there, so oh my God.
I know.
You must be old.
Ancient. Yeah. Very old.
But that's all right. That's kind of makes it really interesting, though. I think there's a few others that I've talked to too who were born there. So. I find this thing about the family, and it says, when the time came for her to go out to Shakopee, Minnesota, with the other two sisters and one lay sister, she looked splendid in her habit. I again saw her on her western trip to Minnesota. That was the last time I saw our sister Jane, said his brother Peter. Now, the abbot, Wimmer, noted that he founded a little mission in Shakopee for the sisters, to the great joy of the English and German Catholics. The new convent had its own story. First, it was a cowshed, then a horse barn, and now it became a woman's convent, but it only serves the most necessary purpose. So Sister Adelaide entered the convent in Pennsylvania in 1859. She received her habit in 1860, made her triennial vows in 1861. She arrived in October here in Shakopee and died of tuberculosis 2 months later. Okay. In fact, it's interesting because that St. Mary's Convent, which was in Pennsylvania, in the first 25 years of their convent, the community lost 22 people who were nuns who died of tuberculosis, ages 17 to 30, including, of course, Sister was buried here in the cemetery. The records in the St. Mark's Church in Shakopee said that Sister Adelaide Elder died 2 months after arriving in Shakopee on December 21st, 1862. And she was buried the next day in the Calvary Cemetery by Father Schroeder, who assisted and anointed her before her death. Now, so all that's great, right? The concept, right? But then we also know that when the nuns in Shakopee at that time, who had the convent and the school for the women, when the priest told them they could not go to the church there, or they couldn't have a pew in the church at St. Mark's, wasn't allowed anymore. And basically the next year he said, you need to be out. And he got a different group of nuns put in instead. These people ended up going to St. Joseph, Minnesota. And so why that is important, because in St. Joseph, Minnesota, they did St. Benedictine. I mean, what's the name of the school there?
St. Ben?
St. Ben's, yeah. Is basically, so if they stayed here, we would have had a nice college here in town. But no. Anyway, when they did that, they also took the coffins of the nuns who had died here and buried them in St. Joseph Cemetery. So here's actually the cemetery, the look of it, it's kind of just interesting. In other words, there's nothing there. But it's also interesting because according to one of the persons who was here, I think, when that happened, say they believe that Sister Adelaide's coffin here in Shakopee, when they took it, there's no body in it. This will be important for later when we talk about the ghost here in Shakopee, in this place. All right. Anyway, that's just an interesting story about her. So I have a picture of her because you can go online and see more about her history, but see, there's no photo. I just cut out another one. But the other part is what she looked like at that time, if that helps. All right. Now I'm going to go and talk about this one right here, and we're just going to stay here. And then we're going to talk about the people right over there, and we're going to just stay, because you should be in mostly shade. slowly it's moving that way, so we'll do this. Okay. So this is tied into Helen Elizabeth Lizzie Everton King, born in 1881, died in 1979. She was born on September 5th, 1881 in Eagle Creek, Minnesota, which is, of course, this is Eagle Creek part, okay? She was the daughter of William Everling and Mary Ann Cup, K-A-U-P, Everling. And it's interesting because when she was growing up, she told stories about growing up in Shakopee to her daughter. And they then made that into a book. We talk about the history of early Shakopee. And in there she says that Helen noticed she was born September 5th, 1881 in Eagle Creek. Such she note that it was on the outskirts of a little town called Shakopee in the state of Minnesota. And later she moved to Shakopee. She also says the Minnesota River flowed nearby, and some Indians live across the bridge and towards the right. You know where that was? Right now, if you go to Huber Park, there's a walking path to go across the water. Okay, if you go there and then go right over there was, some people called it the Shakopee Reservation. It wasn't a reservation because actually some Dakota actually bought the land there for that. But anyway, she said one Sunday afternoon after Sunday school, we had Mass at church in the morning. In the afternoon, we had to go to Sunday school. Anybody remember doing that? I don't remember doing that. But apparently did. We used to have a Wednesday night, there was stuff, I think, if I remember. But anyway, at that afternoon, my sister and two of our girlfriends decided to walk over where the Indians lived. When the young Indian boys saw us coming, they had a fire going and danced and sing along in a circle around the fire. The little Indian girls were playing together and we watched them. They said that the Dakota girls took Lizzie and her friends to their log cabin, where the woman was busy fixing some whole green beans for supper. The woman was so happy to see us, and she gave us some little woven baskets she had made, and they were embroidered with fancy threads that were made to be hung up. When we left, she invited us to come back again. I'm guessing that is Minnie Otherday and her mother, because that's about what they did, and they also gave a lot of their stuff away. She said, Lizzie noticed, she said, my mother was so worried when we came home and told her where we were, as people were afraid of Indians at that time. She said Lisa also remembered, or Lizzie I should say, also remember Indian Lucy, okay, who would gather watercress in the creek in the spring and summer, and twice a week would walk in town to sell it to the townspeople. She was quiet and friendly. Remember, Lucy, this is a picture of her, by the way. Hi. She also remembered old Shoto. He's buried, well, his kids are buried at Belly Cemetery, okay. That was Dakota Indian John Shoto. They said he came across to town occasionally. Old Shoto walked with a cane. He would always walk into our town and shout, woo woo, hey hey, over and over. He said old Shoto was so friendly and nice, and all the children loved him. They would gather around him whenever he walked into town and begged him to count, which he did. And so he would count Unsi, Nutspe, Yamin, Topa, Zapta, and Shakpe. And once he got to number 6, which was Shakopee, they would all cheer over and over. So it's just kind of an interesting thing. And this is kind of an interesting photo because you see downtown Shakopee, and that's the brew hall now in Shakopee. It's still there. But it's just kind of interesting to think. So that was Shoto. She also Lizzie remembers turning from home. Her mother would spread a piece of bread with butter and molasses and give it to Lizzie, I should say, along with lemon soda. She would put some sugar, vinegar, and baking soda in the bottom of a glass and filled it with water, and it would fizz, and we thought it was wonderful. It makes me want to go and try that, actually. Cinnamon, vinegar, and baking soda. How interesting. But she remembers and she talked that to her daughter, and so it's passed along. She also mentioned that there's a fairgrounds right across the street from our house. And this is in Shakopee, and that'd be the where the old ballpark area was, where the thing was. Okay. After supper, all the children would gather there to play tag, ring around the rosy, pump, pull away, run, sheep, run, and drop the handkerchief. Do you remember any of those things? Or doing any of those? Play tag. Of course, most of us have done that, right? Ring around the rosy. Remember that one? Okay. Pump, pull a bone. I remember doing that for some reason. Must be something where you're pulling. Do you remember that?
Well, I heard the name, but I don't.
Yeah, I can't remember much about it, except I do remember growing up and doing that. Run, sheep, run. I don't know what that one is, but and then drop the handkerchief. Okay. So it's just funny what they said. Said in the winter time after supper, we would go sliding on a big long bobsled my brother made on the hills nearby. Everyone went walking after supper. But when I went to the dances, my sister and girlfriends and I would walk about 5 or 6 blocks down to the railroad tracks, where the hand carts were used by the daytime to fix the railroad tracks. But at night, we would pump them up and down, and it would move it down the tracks, and they'd go to 4 miles to the next time to the place of Chaska, river rat place, but anyway, where the dances were held. We would dance until 5 o'clock in the morning. Oh my God. My mother would not allow that. I'm just telling you. Okay. One time when we were going back to the hand car, it rolled down the bank. So they had to go back to the dance to get some boys to pull it up again, and then they pumped the hand rail back to Shakopee for them. She also remembered that in the summers we would walk out to the country and pick wild plums, gooseberries, and green crab apples, which my mother made jam out of. And other than what we know about Helen Lizzie is that she married William King in Shakopee in 1906, and she died in 1979 in St. Paul. It's a picture, but it's not a great picture because it's just a small one, but it does show her at that time. So that's just, she's just an interesting person. I really like it because she told some of the stories and that passed on. Okay. Now we're going to talk about, see the cone right there behind you? Just so you know, so you can look back later if you want to look at it. That is John O'Connor. Okay. He was born probably 1825, died in 1878. They believe he was born in Ireland, but we're not sure. He could have been born in New York. But he moved west. He arrived in Illinois, I should say, near Chicago, in 1858. He married Catherine Neafsey, who was born in Ireland. We'll talk about her in a few minutes, okay? But the family came to Minnesota in 1859, or maybe 1860. In 1861, they moved to the Glendale Township, which is basically part of Savage, okay? They lived there with her wife, her mother, his wife's brother, okay, and their family. In 1865, the O'Connor family in Consistent had John, Katherina, along with their children. Edwin was age 8, Mary, age 7, Julie, age 5, Catherine, age 2, and John Jr., age 1. In other words, a good Catholic family. Big, right? Okay. So we do know that Catherine, her wife, John O'Connor's wife, Catherine, was taking care of the 5 children. And while that was going on, John O'Connor volunteered and joined the 9th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry, Company I. It's kind of weird that he, as a husband, would just say, well, I'm going to go in the army. She didn't even know. He just, decided to join, okay? We do know that the regiment spent the next year in the frontier duty throughout the state. They involved defending the colonist settlers in Minnesota and then people in the South. Now, John O'Connor then was a private in the Army there. We also know that he was found drunk on guard duty and was sent to a military prison. He spent a year in prison. I'm guessing there's a lot of problem with this person. But anyway, he was released with highest regard to his character and work ethic. So while he was there in prison, he worked as a bricklayer and a stone mason in prison. Now that's important because he came back to Shakopee, but he did work on bricks here in Shakopee, okay? When he returned finally, when he finished the army, came back to Glendale, and then they bought a house in downtown Shakopee. The house was on 2nd and Market Street in Shakopee. They sold it for $200. Dang. Okay, it was near the railroad tracks. What's really weird about it, now if you go where it is now, there's nothing there. But the building itself is now in the landing. It's still there. So it's added a story. They added much related to that, but it's just kind of interesting. And we know that John O'Connor worked at the Schroeder Brickyard. That was probably the most prosperous business in the city. The brickyard was located on the Bluff Avenue between Market and Minnesota Street. The bricks were from the Minnesota River near Huber Park. And many of the buildings in Shakopee were made from these bricks. The problem with this job, you only work for 8 months of the year. When it's too cold, they fired them until 4 months later, they hired them again. So for 4 months, he had nothing. I don't think Brooke job was all that profitable for the workers. The people in charge probably make some money, but I'm not sure they really did. Then, to make it even worse, John and Catherine's son Johnny died suddenly in 1866. He was only 5 years old, and he's buried right next to him at the cemetery here. We do know that John O'Connor also had a long, I should say, and problem illness due to an eye injury that he suffered during the war. The injury turned cancerous. What's also interesting is there's all these letters that her wife, Katherina, sent asking to the military, said, can we get compensation because he's cancerous because of what happened in the war, and he was turned down. So he never had it. So he died June of 1878, 78, yes, buried next to his son at Calvary Cemetery, which is right over there. Right. Now, when we talk about that family, I'm going to go and talk about Catherine Heafney O'Connor, born 1834, died April 13th, 1897. She was in Shakopee from 1865 to 1880. She was born immigrant from Ireland, married John O'Connor in Illinois, came to Minnesota. They lived in what is now Savage for a short time. Then, while they were going there, that's when her husband, John O'Connor, joined the army. Okay. When he returned, they went downtown Shakopee. They lived, like I said, on 2nd and Market Street. They sold the house for $200. It was near the train track. So, the husband is gone to the war. They come back. He's working at the brickyard. Catherine is taking care of the kids. Okay. She doesn't have much money. She was not able to read or write, or she signed her name with an X. They did spend a lot of time at the Church of the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church in Shakopee, which became St. Mary's Church in Shakopee. That church is also called the Irish Church. They used to call it the German Church and the Irish Church, right? It's weird because the church is actually just a few blocks away from St. Mark's Church. They're very close together. It was erected in 1866. It was not until 1876 that the church became St. Mark's Catholic Church. Again, John O'Connor, we've got a person over there, died in 1878. And we have, of course, the cemetery of that. Now, go back to Catherine. She's in downtown Shakopee, living near the railroad tracks, okay? And they said she was mad. She was really upset. She had had enough. She grabbed a frying pan and headed outside and went next door to Anna Hilger's house. They were neighbors living on 2nd and Market Street around 1873, and the two ladies started an argument. The two ladies, it escalated to the point where at one point Catherine took the frying pan and hit Anna in the head. I just love when that happens. Well, what the sad part is it becomes in the news because she was found guilty of assaulting her neighbor and was fined $38, which is a lot at that time, but she did pay it. Okay, I do know that part. And we know that eventually that building itself is now part of the landing. It's a brick building there. And Catherine herself ended up moving to St. Paul and died there in 1897. So she's not buried here where the other people are. We also have no records to show whether or not her frying pad was added to the coffin. I always add a few like that. At that part. But it is a funny story and one that we all remember so much because of that. I think there's one we're going to grab before we... Okay. Okay. It's right here, just so you know. And that's Peter Jost, or Yost. Y-O-S-T. Here is that, but sometimes it's J-O-S-T, okay? He was born in 1822 and died in 1895. He was born in Prussia, which later became the German Empire and then became Belgium, just so you know. Her parents were Nikolas and Kathleen Jost. Okay? And what we do know is that by 1850, Peter was living and working as a settler colonist in St. Paul, Minnesota Territory. Now, at the same time, Mary Catherine Katie Benner was born in Germany in 1837. Eventually, Maria Kathy was Katie and Peter got married, okay? In fact, what we know is that Maria's mother, Katherina, died in 1847. Her father, Matt, and their 3 children immigrated to America. And on the trip, her father died on the boat. So the 3 children continued to America. And eventually, Katie married Peter Yost, 1855 in St. Paul. Then they headed up to Shakopee City. Remember the spelling there was S-H-A-K-A-P-E-E, City, in a steamboat. They were at the foot of Home Street. And in fact, they had 10 children. Okay? The first one was actually born 1855, right there on the banks of Home Street on the river. Okay? Peter Yost became the chief of police in Shakopee in 1876. There was a resolution that was passed by the city's government that said his salary was $2 a day and $3 for special day and night assignments. Wow. I guess it must have been enough, but it's not a lot, really, okay? He said his duty include he had to give on every Monday of every month, he had to work from 9 a.m. to midnight. Okay. He also had to be available on the 4th of July, Christmas Day, New Year's Day, and any time that there was a circus in town, or any other published days. He had to work on Sundays from 2 p.m. to midnight. I mean, that's a lot of work. Okay. They said in those days the chief was kept pretty busy. The Shakopee had several saloons, and sometimes there was trouble there. Besides that, the chief was responsible for checking all the saloon licenses, make sure that they were paid, and that all the organizers, the things that they say had to be strictly obeyed. In fact, there was, again, in the newspaper, and once in 1877, people criticized Peter Yost because they said he was in charge of letting the patrons of some saloons on First Street became too noisy, thus disturbing the peace of people walking along the street. You know, there's people like that all the time. You're like, come on! But anyway, he also had his job also, Chief Yost had to be in charge of keeping stray animals off the streets, especially those in the business section. And he was also supposed to round up or send home all dogs found running around town. What the heck?
You just tell the dog to go home?
Yeah, maybe you have to grab him and bring him, I don't know. Between the cows and dogs and occasional intoxicated people, he had his hands full. He also, Chief Peter Yost, was instructed to keep all strangers from creating disturbances within the cities and to keep track of all suspicious people. They said although there was no gangsters in town in 1870s, there were plenty of unwelcome visitors who tried to frisk saloon patrons. They tried to do pickpocketing in the street, so you had to really watch for that. They also said that in the 1870s and the 1880s, the city slickers frequently visited the smaller towns like Shakopee, especially at fair times, and also in holidays in the summer when crowds gathered. The work was crude, but the people had not yet been educated, and they were often victimized. The people from outside were more skillful in what they did, so they were making money out of that. He said in some towns in the early years, the marshal was allowed 50 cents or $1 for each drunk he arrested. That's a good way to make money, though. Okay.
Before they started.
They said in Gaylord, Minnesota, they said, the marshal used to wait outside the saloon that had the most people in it to make a bit of money. They had started. The drunk stayed in the bar and would not leave unless the saloon owner would have someone, and they'd have the marshal come and get it, and then you make the money. Okay. This did not happen, they don't think, in Shakopee. Okay. In Shakopee, the people enjoyed a real beer or a little good whiskey once in a while. Okay. Eventually, Peter Yost, died on August 4th, 1895. He is buried up the hill in Calvary Cemetery. His wife, Katie, died 12 years later on June 21st, 1807. I don't have what happened with her, if she's buried here or she's buried at the Catholic Cemetery on 10th Street at that time, probably. I'll have to look for that, unfortunately. All right. The next one we're going to do before we move over there, well, we're going to just stay here and we'll talk about here and then talk about over there and then we'll have to go over. But I want to talk about Timothy, spelled Thimoty, Timmy Canty, okay? He was born 1825, died in 1884. The problem is this morning I was looking and I was like, wait a minute, I know I found a cemetery here in Shakopee, or in this cemetery, but I couldn't find where it was today. So I'm just going to sit here in the warm or colder area. Okay. He was born in 1822 in Ireland. He was headed to Canada and then to the United States. He came to Holmes Landing, which is what the name of Shakopee was at one point. He was employee of Thomas Holmes. Some people say that he came on the flat bottom wild paddy in the fall of 1851, but other people say he arrived a little after that, so we don't really know which. But we do know that when he was here, because he was involved in the Mexican-American War, or the invasion of Mexico, he was given by the government 80 acres of land, and that's why he ended up being in this area. Timothy married Margaret O'Keefe. She was born in Ireland, came to America in 1851, lived in Chicago and Illinois, moved to St. Paul in 1853. He met Timothy Canty, and the two of them moved near Marystown in a farm in 1854. They had two sons, John and Daniel. We do know that after working with Thomas Holmes, then he worked at the steamboats, including the Greek Slave and the Pocahontas. When the Civil War arrived, he wanted to go and join, okay? But he'd already been in the Mexican War, right? He wanted to go, but then he decided he couldn't because his wife, who had orange hair, was blind. So he decided he was going to stay and take care of it. At least one of the people actually took care of the husband and wife. Anyway, so we go back to this thing, okay. Now we know that they went to, on Lewis Street, there on, which is now Dangerfield, or Turtles, okay, that area, okay. That time it was Germer's store on Lewis Street, Geyermann, okay. And there was this street there. He was also, Peter was actually, was the mayor of Shakopee at one time. His wife was Amelia, okay? And so they're at the store. A lot of people are there. It's kind of a fun place to go, right? And Timothy, our Timothy, who's the one we don't know in here, he said at one point, he said to people, I know General William Tecumseh Sherman. He is a fine officer and a real man. Okay. And the people in the store didn't believe him. Yeah, right. Okay. So anyway, in the late 1860s, the news brought up to Minnesota River said Sherman was making a tour of the South, and he was going to stop in Shakopee. So the people, of course, said, oh, where's Canty? He needs to be here. He claims he knows him, okay? Timothy didn't say much, just whatever, okay? A lot of people in Shakopee said he wouldn't be able to say anything once it actually happened, okay? But on the day of the visit, a cloud of dust was sitting down the hill. People said, here they came. The stagecoach was downtown Shakopee with 4 large horses. The driver swung around the corner at Strunk's drugstore, which is on the south side of the river, on First Avenue at the time, and stopped. A cheer arose, and General Sherman put his hand out the window to acknowledge the greeting. Okay. A cheer arose, and General William Sherman put his head out the window to acknowledge the greeting. Thank you. Yes, I'm great. Here's a picture of him, person, whatever, okay. But he also rode around the crowd. He stopped. He looked at this man who was at the rear of the crowd. Timothy Canty was there. He had come to Shakopee to get his sight. S-C-Y-T-H-E. I can't say that. The big thing that you chop wood stuff with, okay? They need to get that sharpened. He was still carrying the sight. I don't know, in my head I can feel it, but it's not coming out. Okay. Anyway, so Sherman yelled out, "Hello, Tim! Don't you remember me?" Tim came forward and shook hands. They say for some time their hands were clasped in the embarrassed settlers who had doubted Tim's claim. He saw tears welling in the eyes of the 2 veterans, the general of all the armies and the humble homesteader. And that was the end of that story, except that people remembered it so much because it was such a big thing that he was serious. He was involved with that. Okay, we do know that Timothy Canty died in 1885. He's buried at the Calvary Cemetery here in Shakopee. His wife, Margaret, moved with her son for the next 16 years. She wasn't able to see it all. Okay, she died in 1900 and buried next to her husband Timothy. Somewhere in this grave area, I just couldn't see it today. Some days you can see it. I know I had it because I come here all the time to look at different ones. Anyway, somewhere in there is the thing for them. Or it could have been one that they never found, but it is on the list over there, so just so you know. Just a second, I gotta go to this next. Okay, the one back here we're going to just look at from here instead, but you might afterwards want to look because it's kind of an interesting thing. This is the Vitaline Lebeau Boan, 1836 to 1916. I don't know how to really spell it, but that is a woman's name. Even that I had to look because I was like, okay, that is a woman. And she's buried over there. She was born in Montreal, Canada. When she was a young adult, she was married, and then her husband died. We don't know the name of the husband there, but anyway, we just know that she was recently widowed. So she ended up moving to near Shakopee, settled south of Shakopee with a relative. Probably the name of Jean-Baptiste Lebeau. Remember about him because Jean-Baptiste Lebeau is the one who went with Thomas Holmes and William Quinn down in 1851. Okay. And we do know that on February 11th, 1861, Vitaline Lebeau married Frank Xavier Boan, B-O-A-N, at St. Mark's Catholic Church. And that person, I call him Frank, but it's really F-R-A-N-C with a little thing, O-I-S. How does it?
Francois.
Francois, yeah. But I'm not going to remember.
My name's Simone, so I know all the
Very
French
good.
pronunciations.
So anyway, my problem is, since I had my stroke, I look at it, I know it, but I cannot say it. I was wrong. So anyway, he was born 1831 in Quebec. He was a clock worker and a watchmaker and a jewelry downtown Shakopee. Okay. They lived in Shakopee on lot 4 and 5, block 51 in Shakopee, and they had 8 children. And I'm just going to show a picture of, so you can see it, but because it's a small picture, but it's just interesting to actually have a nice, look like a nice place, right? So they had 8 children. Okay, that's important because as you see after you look over there, you'll see several of them are buried. Okay. Now Frank, as I call him, as you said, totally the right one, but okay, he was an alcoholic. Sorry.
How do the French Canadians work?
Right. The reason is because one of her granddaughters said that the family lived in fear continuously, never knowing when the father would come home and beat his wife, Vitaline, and children. Okay. The passing of time, life became more and more intolerable. And so with the permission of St. Mary's pastor, Vitaline kicked Frank out of the house. Now I'm pretty amazed that the pastor, the priest, actually did that. You know, usually said just suffer, you know. But anyway, it's interesting. They know that this happened prior to the 1885 Minnesota census. And we also know that Frank, as I call him, moved to Duluth. He died in 1900 and was buried in Duluth. The Vitaline, after some peaceful years, died March 25th, 1916, and buried at Valley Cemetery in Shakopee. And that's the one right back there. And you'll also notice her children, Mary, Francis, Rose, Vitaline, and Leo, was also buried there too. So there's little signs, little ones of all of them. You can go look if you want. Okay, right over there, just behind you, just so you know, is Katherina Freihaut Reis, 1802 to 1867. And there's actually a picture of her, which is just amazing when you find pictures. She was born in Germany, married Valentine Reis in Germany. He's buried right over here too. He was born in 1795, and that was his picture there too. So good that they had pictures for all of them. They had 12 children. Some of these people had a lot of children. Now I think it's probably the Catholic thing. It's also just the thing, you know, you just do it. It just happened. And, they probably helped with to have more people to do some of the work, too. Okay. They headed to America. They arrived in New Orleans in 1846. Then they moved to St. Louis. Okay. Valentine was a shoemaker for several years. They said he worked really well with repairing shoes. Meanwhile, Katherina was working with children. I think she really enjoyed it, but she had 12 kids. That's like a lot of work just by itself. Okay. By 1960, the family moved to Shakopee. Within a few years, Katherina died in 1867. She was 64 years old. She's buried here, over there, okay? Her husband, Valentine, died in 1874, buried also right over here, okay? Now, the Reis family is interesting because that's the people who had this cemetery and given it to the St. Mark's, okay? George Reis paid $1,000 in 1875 to some property on the northeast corner of First Avenue and Home Street in Shakopee. It became the George Reis Hardware, Stove, and Tinware Store. And you've probably seen that. You don't see 1875 photos of downtown Shakopee. It's really kind of a cool building. Eventually, in January of 1883, he built a 2-story brick building that had a hardware store and other business in the first floor, and an opera house on the second floor, and also a dance hall. And also, if I remember correctly, asking people, they said later it became, people used to go there to play basketball. Not basketball. Basketball, yeah. At that place. It's very great. The only problem said there's no shower, so it's stinky. Okay, that's what this is. The people are saying. I'm just telling. Okay. It's also interesting because the block had a sign of the thing to say the name of the family, but they said Reiss, which really was spelled wrong. It's Reis. Okay. But the opera house was a big thing in Shakopee. They'd have things going there all the time, in the thing. They said the opera house could seat an audience of 350 people. The interior was, the stagecoach and everything was painted by the person in town who also did Babe's Bar, the thing that is torn down now, but they're the thing. They said that the first grand opening they did Macbeth. Okay. And so just in terms of what it looks like, there's the opera house is on the side. That was torn down much more recently, but it was torn down, which is too bad. So anyway, that's the Reis family, and to remember them also. Okay, I'm staying right here for this next part because it's hot out. Alright, I just gotta get the ones set up the right way. One of them is over there. Okay, so I'm going to just talk, but you can look at them afterwards, but I'm just going to talk about the rest from here, I think. So Mary Julia Ehman Lies, Lies, 1832 to 1869. She's born in Luxembourg. They have very little information about how they got here, but she did arrived in America. They lived in Buffalo, New York, met Peter Lies. Lees is actually, because you go with the second, Lies. Lees, okay. Peter, who she gets married to, he was one of 16 children in that family. 4 of the kids died when they were young. What's really interesting about that also is when you look through the history of people, the Lies family, they said they have a list. They said there's 16 were born, right? 4 died when they were young. There's one other child that's there on the list of 16, but there's no information about him. It says a story has it that one of the children, when they were in New York City, one of the child walked away and they never found him again. And then they don't even put him in the thing. This is just my little thing, but that gets a big thing for me. I'm like, I really want to know about this story. He just walked away and they can't find him afterwards. Interesting. Okay. And we know that Peter Lees, came to the United States in 1847. They said he came supposedly into the wilderness of North America. When he got here, he thought he'd go to California to the gold rush, but decided not to. So he ended up to a sawmill near Buffalo, New York. He had a wife, an Irish woman, who died shortly after getting married. Why, my question, I put this as a question for you all too. How did Peter forget the name of his brother and his first wife? Weird. I put weird in there. I mean, it's just, you can't find anything about it. So he married somebody, but nobody wrote down the name of the person he married? This is the first wife, okay. But we do know that in 1853, Mary Julius Ehman married him in New York, okay. The first kids, first 2 were in New York, were born. Then they settled in Stillwater, Minnesota, and by 1858 they moved to Shakopee. Then Mary, which I think is the one over there, okay, she continued to have children. She had Frederick, Susanna, John August, Matthias, and Harriet, okay. So at that point, Mary was 37 years old. She had 7 children, and she dies. Probably from having all those children. That's what we say today is like, oh my God. But anyway, so she was buried in the cemetery over there. Here, I should say. So just so you know, Peter, the wife, he's listed there as the wife of, or the husband of, okay? He served in the Civil War. He married for the 3rd time. He married Maria Pass, P-A-S-S, in St. Paul. They had 5 children. He's got a lot of children, okay? And he died in 1909 in Stillwater, Minnesota. And they're buried in Stillwater. So that's just an interesting story. But the Lies had the store on Lewis Street on the south side till it burnt down. Anyway. All right. Then the next one we talk about is these 2 right over there. You see 1 stone there, but it's 2 people. First one is Johannes, Josephis, Antonius, and Anthony Entrup. Got it? 1821 to 1876. He was born in Prussia, moved to America, arrived in New York in 1849, moved to St. Louis, met Elizabeth Lizette Schmitz, okay, and they got married in St. Louis. They moved to Shakopee in April of 1855. It says, it was not until the very dawn of 1856 that they had offered in the midst of holy sacrifice of the Mass, which according to their belief is the most important single rite of the Church. The first Holy Mass in Shakopee was offered at the home of Entrup on January 1st, okay, by Reverend George Keller, who was from St. Paul. It was on that bitterly cold New York day that the Catholics determined to organize and agreed to meet 6 days later. And in the meeting, Anton, along with Mr. Strunk, Mr. Collar, Mr. Albertin, I think I should say, they looked for the location for St. Mark's Church. They bought lots 4 and 5 for $250, and the first church was built of native limestone for $986.50. I always love that they add, they're very specific. Okay. He was charged, Anton was charged of the masonry, okay? And if you look at the St. Mark's Church, it's the little one on the left side, and then they did the other one afterwards, just so you know. So, now, after that, Anton was working here in Shakopee and in Jordan. While he was in Jordan, he was up on a building in 1876. He fell down from the roof and died. He was 55 years old. And so he's buried at the cemetery here in Shakopee. And we're going to talk about then her wife. This person, I would like to find out more information. I found out a little bit, but not enough that I'm not too happy about it. But anyway, I call her Dr. Lizette Schmitz Entrup, okay? She was born in Germany in 1823. She was a great soprano singer. The physician in Germany hired her to sing to her son, okay? So she ended up living with the the doctor. He studied, they had books about medicine, so she sat and learned all about medicine while she was there. Then she decided to move to America. She first settled in St. Louis. She met Anton, who just mentioned. They got married in St. Louis, came to Shakopee in 1855. Remember then, her husband dies falling from the roof, okay? So the wife decides to become a doctor in Shakopee. Now technically she's not really a doctor because she's never gone to school for that. But she had read all this kind of stuff, she knew what was going on. So what we do know is that they believe that Lizette became basically how they lived on. From that day until her death in 1895, she practiced steadily and be able to have a good home for her 6 children and got them started in life. When she became practiced in Shakopee, the settlement was still just getting started. There was no railroad. The only way of travel was with the Minnesota River and the crude trails. The pioneer doctor drove all through these areas with an oxen, winter or summer, day or night, and she always greeted her patient with a cheery smile. They said no trip was too long or arduous for our mother, said Mrs. A.M. Strunk, one of her 6 children. She never thought of herself. She was interested only on her patients. Many a night she fought her way through a winter storm behind her oxen to reach the bedside of a patient. Sometimes she suffered severely. I remember one time she came home one winter morning. We children met her at the door. "Oh, Mother," we shouted in chorus, "your face is frozen." Sure enough, both cheeks and her nose and chin were white and numb. Mother simply went outside, rubbed snow on her face, and thought no more about it. How interesting. And it also said, they said she was a few physicians in the Minnesota Valley at the time, so she was busy all the time, okay? Specifically with women's giving birth, okay? She said she was in Glencoe, Jordan, Belle Plaine, New Prague. Her fame traveled far and wide, and at the height of her career, she was one of the most widely known physicians in the state. Now it's interesting, I looked through a thing about doctors in Minnesota, and they don't talk about her. I don't understand.
You never want to know that, right?
Yeah, but I know, but still, anyway, one person said about her, she brought more babies into the world in this section of the state than any other physician in her time or since. Now, I don't know if to say since because that was then, but it's just interesting. And so their burials are right over there, just so you know. But that's just an interesting person that you really want to find out more information. But I was trying to find out who the person was, and I was talking to some of the Strunks. They're not sure who the person. So we haven't found out the right person who would have that information, but I'm still looking. All right, now I'm going to talk about. I have 3 more. How are you doing in time? I don't know where my thing is. So, what time are we?
11:30.
Okay, so we should be okay. Okay, Catherine Lyon Mullen, 1818 to 1865. She was born in Ireland, okay, and a lot of people who were living in this area were often born in Ireland. The Great Famine was a period of starvation in Ireland from 1845 to 1852. They're not sure how many people died during the famine, but they know that the population decreased by the average of 20%, half of whom died, half immigrated from there. Some people felt, the magistrate in there said, "I found so great an advantage of getting rid of the pauper population on their property." They said, "I considered the failure of the potato crop on being the greatest possible value. In one respect, we got rid of the people. They left or they died." So anyway, we know that many came from that time, and Catherine Lyon headed to the United States sometime between 1845 and 1846. In New York, she met Thomas Mullen Jr. Okay, they had 8 children. Most of them were born in Wisconsin, then Indiana, then in St. Paul, and Margaret, Julia were born in Eagle Creek Township. Okay. They loved all their children, but Catherine Lyon got sick and died in 1865. She was 42 years old. So there's a tombstone of that one. I don't know where it is here, but it's just interesting. She was, it says Catherine, wife of Thomas Mullins, died June 13th, 1965, age 82 years. May her soul rest in peace. Amen. I just find it so interesting to find out more about the history of women in Shakopee, because there's not much in the books about it, but they were really did some really interesting things, but also often they died so young. So just FYI. Way back over there, which we're not going to see, we're just going to look here and go, I'll see that where the Cohen is over there. That's John Nikolas Wampach. He was born June 27th, 1870 in Shakopee. The family father, John, was the wagon maker trade. Okay, they came in America in 1852. He did for 2 years in Detroit, Michigan. Then he lived in Ohio and Indiana, moved to Chicago, and then in 1857 moved to Shakopee. They built a blacksmith shop and a wagon shop on 2nd Avenue in Shakopee. He was very good, and so he did so much of work by hand, and they got so many requests that he expanded the business before time. Actually in 1870, just before the birth of the son John, they moved the place on 1st Avenue, and it was a big building. According to the sketch of Shakopee, Minnesota, it says, the wagon and carriage factory of the Wampach Manufacturing Company that makes some of the best vehicles sold in the Northwest. You know Wampach's in downtown Shakopee? It's relative. Okay. We knew that in March, Anne Marie Hartz Wampach was 6 months pregnant. The blizzards struck north of Iowa and Minnesota. There was 14 inches of snow. It was actually the first use of the time where they used the word blizzard. Okay. It came from what was for boxing. It meant a volley of punches. Okay. So Mary Ann was worried. A few months later, John Nikolas Wampach was born. They knew he was not feeling so well. They knew that cholera, measles, tuberculosis, diphtheria, smallpox, all those things were happening there. Now, what happened to him? We don't know. We can't find any information except that 1 year and 3 months after he was born, he died. And it's very few, so it's a small thing. So I just asked this because it's kind of interesting. The tombstone says, son of J and A Wampach, aged 1 year, 3 months. So it's just kind of, again, these are ones that, the thing is, why you wanted, if you have some stories, write it down or videotape them, because it's stories that people want to find out. And people, like, I still got, someone know what happened, something, but he died. That's how we know, and quickly, unfortunately. And then finally, the last one, I think it's the one all the way over there. And that's Margaret, Bridget, Holly, O'Loughlin, I should say, 1824 to 1886. She was born in Ireland. In the 1840s, she moved to New Orleans. She really was there. She was going to New Orleans, then she was going to go meet her brother in Pennsylvania. According to the O'Loughlin family tree, they said that Margaret was at a sailing ship to New Orleans. She met a well-to-do woman who talked her into going and work for her in New Orleans. The woman said if Margaret doesn't like it, the woman pay her to go to her brother's place in Pennsylvania. According to Margaret, she never saw her brother again, or any of her other relatives. I'm just saying, what the heck? Okay. But we do know that in New Orleans, Margaret married Dennis O'Loughlin, who was born in Ireland. Okay. They talked about Dennis. He was a medium-sized man with light complexion, although she turned darker after contracting yellow fever. Margaret was a good-sized woman, very outspoken, and could express herself in no uncertain terms. That is a great description of everything. Okay. They married in New Orleans. In 1850, they took a steamboat to St. Paul, Minnesota Territory. Dennis worked in the river. They actually owned lot, which now is the state capital. So they should have held on to that. Should have got some good money. But anyway, the first of 9 children were born in Minnesota, starting with Mary Ann, who was born in St. Paul, and the rest were born in the Eagle Creek Township. What we do know is that Dennis, they were visiting some relatives in Le Sueur County, and they stopped in Shakopee. He met another Irishman who persuaded him to move to Eagle Creek Township, and he did. They bought 160 acres of land. The land, according to Dennis O'Connor III, said was mostly covered with hardwood timber, some natural wild hay fields. There's a creek across one corner and a small part of lake on the property. All of land had to be cleared. The first buildings were upon a rise of ground, near the center of the land. But the log cabin and the house were built near the creek. And then Margaret, our person Margaret, says, I know that her husband was a hard-working man, but he often would go to Shakopee and meet with his old cronies. He wouldn't come home until sometimes I went there to get him and bring him home. Okay. Then he wouldn't go again for a couple of months. His well-like never quarreled. Okay. So apparently, often she'd be working here in Eagle Creek. She had to go to Shakopee, grab him, bring him back home.
All the way over to Shakopee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
2 miles. But that's a bit probably okay. We also know that Dennis and Margaret sold their lots in St. Paul to get money to bring their parents over from Ireland. They know that the O'Loughlin's parents, Michael, used to swear in Gaelic. How do you say that? Thank you. Okay. And Bridget also. Both of them were buried here, but there's no tombstones. So it's on the list on the thing over there, so just so you know. Okay. So meanwhile, the Civil War had been going on for 3 years in 1864, when someone from Shakopee came out and told Dennis that his name was on the list. he's going to be called up. He said, if you are enlisted yourself and you go there and say, I want to volunteer, then her father or her family would get $300 bounty. So Dennis went to Fort Snelling and enlisted in the 9th Minnesota Volunteer because there are other men from Ireland who are also there. Okay. So Margaret used to walk to church to St. Mark's from here, 5 miles there and back. Sometimes, someone from Shakopee came and told Margaret that Dennis had just enlisted 7 in the morning in the army. So she walked to Fort Snelling. He arrived at 1 p.m. These people are crazy. Great for them, but wow. Okay. So Dennis was allowed to come back home to her wife and the kids for one last time. The children remember the stick candy he brought to them, and the youngers got to wear Dennis' soldier cap. Okay. So meanwhile, Margaret's here. She's taking care of the 9 children. The oldest was 13 years old. The youngest was 6 months old. Margaret had 12 acres cleared. She dug ditches. She built rail fences. The family owned cows, but nobody had any horses at that time. Oxen was the only source of power, but it's not known whether they even had an oxen. She was working hard. Now Dennis joined the Army, the Union force in Nashville. In a letter home, he said, I am at the highest courage and good health, but I feel very much homesick and lonely after the children. A few days later, he was hit with a bullet hole between the left thigh and groin. He got gangrene, which ate through his artery, and he bled to death. Dennis was buried in Nashville, Tennessee on December 29th, 1864. We actually have, I don't have it here, but there's a photo from Nashville that shows it there, okay? So Margaret was left a widow with 9 small children. She got only $6 a month pension first year, but by the time she died, she got $12, okay, a month. She absolutely never considered marrying again. Margaret was a midwife. She also would lay out the dead. At the wakes, she would sing a death chant. And she said her children hated it and asked her to stop singing. I kind of wanted to hear what the Irish death chant was, but anyway. It's also interesting that at one point a squatter built a cabin on her land. If she allowed it, she would have lost the creek and the lake. So when the squatter went out to get his family to bring him back here, Margaret burnt down the cabin. He did not try to build another. So they said Margaret's strength and fortuity were great. That is really a great story about a person. She also was a great singer and dancer. It is said that she could play tunes on the floor with her feet, bring them out as well as she could when playing on some musical instrument. She was also one of the hardest workers in getting donations to build the Church of the Immaculate Conception, or St. Mary's Church, in 1864. She would go ask donations from people no one ever think of to ask, and she would get it. Okay, the church was dedication in March of 1866. It was snowing, raining, thundering, and lightning all day, but Margaret and her daughter Nellie walk to the dedication. Whip in the rain. All right. So Margaret, Bridget Haley O'Loughlin died October 7th, 1886 in Eagle Creek Township. Here became Shakopee and is buried here. That's a cemetery here. So that's a good one to end at because that's a great story, huh? But again, it's stories that. Now, why didn't they talk about that in the Shakopee story? That was a great, this whole story. But anyway, so that's why we make sure we get that information out there. And just so you know, ShakopeeHeritage.org. If you go in there and look for people of Shakopee, SHA space K apostrophe space PAY. They have about 400 brochures there. More to come. Half of them are women, half are men. 40% are people of color. And so it's good to find more information that they don't necessarily find in the books but are there. So a lot of people from the cemetery are in there too. So keep finding out new stories. If you find more, let me know also because we continue adding on to that stuff. All right? Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Ghost story?
What?
A ghost.
Oh! Thank God you have this. I would have forgotten the ghost. Thank you for it. Okay. There is a book. This is what it's called. Twin Cities Haunted Handbook. 100 Ghostly Places in Minneapolis and St. Paul area. Okay? It has in there's 2 pages, and it's talking about this cemetery. Okay. We know that Calvary Cemetery was an old farm. Eventually, they decided to build the cemetery here. But over time, more and more houses, as you can see here, continued. Okay. In this area here, along here, was called Howard Edition. In fact, sometimes people call this cemetery the Howard Edition Cemetery. Okay. But technically, it's the other one, Calvary Cemetery. Okay. Now, the ghost story is, once in a while, people from the suburban houses around here report a break-in. This is odd, they said, because this is a good neighborhood, says the book, okay? Crimes such as this are almost never heard, okay? The second reason odd about that is because there's evidence that someone broke in, but nothing was taken. Okay. Cabinets and cupboards were open. The contents would be strewn about. Muddy footprints would be tracked through the house. Nothing was taken. The doors and windows were locked. The victim of these strange crimes blame the cemetery. They know the cemetery is haunted, they said. Now this is a while ago when this book was written, okay? They simply clean up and go on with their lives, okay? They also notice that cars, when they drive by the highway, which is right over there, okay, at nighttime, sometimes it would stall out or completely die directly in front of the cemetery. Okay. Others would peer into the cemetery after dark, and they would see a little boy in 19th century clothing lurking in the cemetery. If the boy sees you, he will hide behind a tree and peer out at you from behind the tree until you either approach or walk away. Picture just for effect, because it wasn't, but okay. And then my little thing that I said. And the fact is, we still don't know any more than that. But where there are people who say this thing is the people, there's a ghosts here. I think if there's any ghosts, it's probably all the people who died, who they lost the thing, the things that were all broken up, in 1850 or 1947 when they broke down all the cemeteries and they re things back together. It's not really in the right order. People don't like that. The fact that there's a list now eventually of all the people who were buried here, and the list is probably 3 or 4 times the people that are actually here. So there's someone around who's kind of pissed off. Now we'll add one more last tide into that your experience. One from here. Okay, go ahead.
So I was over here a couple of years ago for this presentation, and we talked about the ghost story, and I didn't think anything of it, and I went home. The next morning,
She lives close to here.
I live on the other side of the division.
Yes.
My cabinet doors were all open. There were lights on downstairs, and nobody'd been downstairs, and this went on for a couple of days. And I finally said, my kids are grown, there's no toys here, there's no candy here, leave. And that's the last I've seen of them. But I am not driving straight home from here.
Isn't that interesting? So, I mean, there could be something going on, or, who knows? It's just an interesting story to tell. And it's fun to remember it too, because people kind of like the story, so. Do not be here after dark, because you're not supposed to anyway. But you're free to come and visit this cemetery at any time. Make sure you lock the thing at the gate. But other than that, you're free to come and look around too. It is a really nice cemetery. It's very small. I think there used to be a lot more. It all went down there, but I'm guessing it was over there too. And I think they got rid of, sold off a lot, and then they just have what's left is here. So this is not, you can't bury in this cemetery at all. So it's just here for that. All right.
Who maintains
Thank
the
you.
cemetery?
What's that?
Who maintains it?
So the Catholic Church in Shakopee, and then they have several people who kind of help. There is I just talked to a person who's the Eagle Scout, the women part of that. It's not called Eagle Scout, it's something else. She's like 18. She's gonna do a whole thing with this and get some more people here to kind of watch it. So we'll find out more soon. So it is interesting though, isn't it? Yeah. It is a cool cemetery and interesting story. So all right. Thank you, everybody.